At a busy gas station, tires screeched as a patrol car blocked the exit. "Where'd you steal that car, boy?" an officer barked, shoving a black man wearing a blue Navy suit. His partner splashed hot coffee on him and shouted, "Assault!" The crowd gasped, mothers pulling kids back as phones came up to record. The crowd thought it was over, but it was only the beginning. Before we dive in, where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Michael Carter made a decision that Tuesday morning that would change everything. Instead of driving straight to the Marietta Police Department for his first day as the new chief, he pulled into a Chevron station directly across the street from his future workplace. The digital clock on his dashboard read 8:23 a.m. His official welcome meeting wasn't scheduled until 10. He wanted to observe his new community firsthand before taking command. See how officers interacted with citizens during routine patrol work. Understand the real dynamics beneath the official reports he'd studied. 25 years of law enforcement had taught him that the truth about a department's culture could only be found on the streets, not in conference rooms. The Georgia sun was already climbing higher, promising another humid summer day in the suburbs north of Atlanta. Michael stepped out of his black rental sedan, his blue Navy suit under the morning light as he reached for the gas pump. Today was supposed to be simple. Meet the officers, review departmental protocols, begin the delicate process of building trust with a community he'd never served before. He'd done this dance in 3 other southern cities during his 25-year career in law enforcement. But this time felt different. The night before, Michael had sat alone in his hotel room reading personnel files until well past 2 in the morning. Coffee had grown cold on the nightstand as he studied page after page of citizen complaints, incident reports, and disciplinary actions. 2 names kept appearing with disturbing frequency: Officer Kane and Officer Doyle. The pattern was unmistakable to someone with his experience. Excessive force complaints that mysteriously vanished from departmental records. Camera equipment that suffered convenient malfunctions during arrests. Witnesses who changed their stories between initial statements and final reports. Michael knew that pattern. He'd seen it destroy communities from Birmingham to Charleston. More importantly, he'd lived it. As he squeezed the pump handle and watched the numbers climb on the digital display, his mind drifted back to a sweltering afternoon 29 years earlier. He'd been 16 then, walking home from the Jefferson County Public Library in Birmingham with an armload of books about constitutional law and criminal justice. His school uniform was pressed clean, his shoes polished, his homework completed. That's when the patrol car had pulled up beside him on 6th Avenue South. "Boy, where you think you're going with all them books? You steal those from somewhere." The memory still burned. 29 years later, and that word still hit like a physical blow. Boy, not young man, not son. Boy, as if his age, his education, his dreams meant nothing compared to the color of his skin. That 16-year-old kid had become a police officer because he believed the system could change from within. Today at 45, Chief Michael Carter was about to discover whether he'd been naive or prophetic. He finished pumping gas and clicked the nozzle back into place, then glanced across the busy 4-lane street at the Marietta Police Department. The brick building looked solid and respectable, with American and Georgia state flags hanging limp in the still morning air. Officers were coming and going through the front entrance, starting their shifts with coffee cups and casual conversations. Just another normal Tuesday morning in small-town Georgia. Michael had no idea that 2 of those officers were already watching him through the windshield of their patrol car, making calculations that would destroy their careers and transform their community forever. Officer Kane's cold blue eyes narrowed as he studied the well-dressed black man filling his tank at the Chevron station. "Look at this guy," he said to his partner, slowing their patrol car to get a better view. "Too clean, too confident. Acts like he belongs where he don't." Kane had been wearing a badge for 15 years, and in that time he'd developed what he privately called a 6th sense for trouble. This stranger at Pump 3 was definitely trouble. Something about his posture, the way he moved with easy confidence instead of the nervous deference Kane expected from people who looked like him. The expensive clothes and rental car plates only made it worse. Uppity was the word that came to mind. The location made Kane feel even more brazen than usual. This was his territory, He and Doyle had been running community education right here in full view of headquarters for years. The department brass had made it clear through their silence that certain enforcement methods were tolerated, even encouraged, as long as complaints didn't generate too much paperwork. The police union had his back. Fellow officers knew better than to interfere with his methods. Even the sergeant on duty would find reasons to be elsewhere when Kane needed to handle problem citizens. Doyle, Kane's eager 28-year-old partner, leaned forward in the passenger seat like a hunting dog catching a scent. Want me to run his plates, see what comes up? Nah. Let's introduce ourselves first. Personal touch. Kane's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed his work. Time for some community education. Kane's philosophy was elegantly simple: keep people in their proper place and everyone stays safer. The troublemakers, the ones who got ideas above their station, they needed adjustment. Real adjustment, not the kind you learned in sensitivity training seminars or diversity workshops. Remember that Rodriguez situation last month? Doyle asked, though there was a slight tremor in his voice that hadn't been there during their earlier encounters. Something about the growing number of people with smartphones was making him nervous lately. Kane's expression held no warmth whatsoever. Kid learned real quick after our educational conversation in the back seat. Whole family crosses the street when they see us coming now. That's what I call effective community policing. They both laughed, but Doyle's laughter seemed forced, uncertain. He'd noticed the way some of the other younger officers had started looking at them differently, whispering in corners. The new federal oversight everyone was talking about made him uneasy, though Kane insisted it was all political theater that would blow over. Kane had trained Doyle carefully over their 3 years as partners. The younger man understood that real police work happened in the spaces between official procedures, where cameras couldn't see and civilian witnesses had selective memory problems. Doyle's daddy had raised him right, taught him about the natural order of things and how some folks needed occasional reminding about their proper place in society. Problem with people like that, Kane continued, nodding toward Michael as he gestured for Doyle to grab their gear, is they think some fancy words written on old paper make them equal to hard-working Americans. But constitutional rights are what we say they are, out here on the street where it actually matters. Doyle nodded like an eager student absorbing wisdom from a respected professor, though his hand moved unconsciously to his service weapon with less confidence than before. What's the play, partner? Kane pulled their patrol car into the gas station, positioning it carefully to block the exit closest to Michael's rental car. It was a standard tactical move when you wanted to control a civilian's options for departure. Standard community outreach, he said, checking his own weapon and adjusting his badge to catch the morning sunlight. Help our visitor understand local customs and expectations. Neither officer knew they were looking at their new commanding officer. That ignorance would cost them everything they'd built over years of systematic intimidation and abuse. But for now, they climbed out of their patrol car with the confidence of men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions, ready to teach another lesson about respect and knowing your place in Marietta, Georgia. Michael noticed the patrol car's approach immediately, the deliberate way it entered the gas station, the tactical positioning that blocked his most direct exit route, the unhurried confidence of the two officers as they emerged from their vehicle. His pulse quickened slightly, muscle memory from decades of police work recognizing predatory behavior even when he was on the receiving end. Easy, he told himself, forcing his breathing to remain steady. You've handled worse situations than this. But if this escalates without proper documentation, the thought sent an uncomfortable chill down his spine, reminding him how vulnerable any citizen could be when facing corrupt officers, regardless of their background or connections. An elderly Latina woman at the pump behind him, Ana Morales, had stopped filling her tank, though the automatic shutoff hadn't clicked yet. She was making a show of cleaning her windshield with the squeegee, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands shook slightly as she worked. This woman knew what was coming. She'd seen this performance before. Dr. Eleanor Grant, a retired university professor filling her hybrid sedan at Pump 6, paused mid-transaction to observe the unfolding scene. Her sharp academic mind immediately recognized the dynamics at play. Several mothers dropping their children off at the nearby elementary school had also stopped to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Two officers approached across the hot asphalt. The older one moved with the swagger of a man who'd never been successfully challenged, his pale eyes already cataloging Michael's expensive clothes and confident posture as signs of disrespect. The younger officer hung back slightly, nervous energy radiating from his thin frame like heat waves off summer pavement, his eyes darting occasionally toward the growing number of potential witnesses. "Morning there," Officer Kane said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Just doing some routine community outreach. Mind if I ask what brings you to our neighborhood today?" The emphasis on "our" was subtle but unmistakable, a territorial claim wrapped in conversational politeness. Michael had heard that tone before, in 3 different cities, always preceding encounters that could go very wrong very quickly. He'd also shared those patterns with federal contacts who had been documenting similar incidents across the region. "Getting gas," Michael replied, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Kane's expression flickered like a candle in wind. Most people got nervous at this point, started explaining themselves, apologizing for imaginary offenses, trying to de-escalate a situation they didn't understand. This man seemed almost amused. That reaction set Kane's teeth on edge. "You're not from around here, are you?" Kane pressed, his tone still conversational but with an edge creeping in. "We like to know who's visiting our community." "Just passing through," Michael said calmly. Kane noticed the growing crowd of onlookers, several with phones out. His jaw tightened. This was supposed to be a simple intimidation, but the man's composure was making him look ineffective in front of witnesses. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Kane said, his voice hardening as he dropped the pretense of casual conversation. Michael complied, producing his driver's license with deliberate calm. Kane examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, taking far longer than necessary while clearly hoping to provoke some reaction. "Atlanta address," Kane noted loudly, ensuring the growing crowd could hear. "Long way from home, aren't you, boy?" The racial epithet hung in the air like a slap. Several witnesses gasped audibly. Michael's jaw tightened involuntarily. "Stay professional, document everything. Remember, this is bigger than just you." But he forced his voice to remain level. "Is there a problem with my identification, officer?" Kane's face flushed as he realized his provocation hadn't worked as intended. The man remained maddeningly calm, almost professional. Worse, several people were now openly recording the interaction. "Step away from the vehicle," Kane ordered, his voice rising with frustration. "We're conducting a safety inspection." It was then that Doyle made his move, though Michael could see the younger officer's hesitation, the way he glanced nervously at Dr. Grant's raised smartphone before committing to the action. Emboldened by his partner's escalating anger but clearly uncomfortable with the number of witnesses, Doyle sniffed the air theatrically, then announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear, "I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle. We need to conduct a search." The accusation sent a ripple of shock through the gathering witnesses. Some reached for their phones, sensing drama unfolding. Anna Morales gripped her squeegee tighter, while Dr. Grant pulled out her smartphone and began recording. "That's interesting," Michael said calmly, "since I don't use any controlled substances and this is a rental car I picked up yesterday." But Kane saw an opportunity to regain control of the situation. If the man wanted to play smart, he'd show him how things really worked when cameras weren't around. As Michael complied with the search order, he noticed the crowd's reaction was mixed. While Anna Morales and Dr. Grant stood their ground, several other customers quietly finished their business and left, clearly uncomfortable with being potential witnesses to whatever was developing. A few mothers with children in their cars pulled away from the station entirely, not wanting their kids to see what might happen next. Only a handful of people remained, Anna Morales, still gripping her squeegee but now openly watching Dr. Grant, who had positioned herself to record, and a teenage boy walking to school who had stopped to watch his smartphone out but his hands shaking as he tried to decide whether recording was worth the risk. During the search, Doyle emerged from the passenger side carrying a large coffee cup. Without warning, he accidentally spilled the hot liquid across Michael's blue navy suit. "Oops," Doyle said with mock concern, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with escalating the situation in front of so many witnesses. Sorry about that. Must have been sitting where it could fall. Michael felt the hot coffee soaking through his shirt, the deliberate humiliation burning almost as much as the liquid itself. For a moment, anger flashed through him. These bastards think they can do whatever they want, but he forced himself to remain controlled. He calmly removed a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and began dabbing at the liquid, his movements controlled and precise. When he spoke, his voice carried across the now quiet parking lot. "I understand," Michael said quietly, his tone carrying an undertone that made the teenager's recording hand stop shaking. This wasn't the voice of a victim, this was something else entirely. Kane felt the shift in atmosphere and realized he was losing control of the narrative. The man's dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation was making the officers look like bullies rather than professionals. Worse, those who had stayed to watch were clearly sympathetic to their target. "You're being uncooperative and showing signs of possible impairment," Kane announced, his voice rising to ensure everyone present could hear. "We're placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace and resisting lawful detention." As they forced Michael's hands behind his back to apply the handcuffs, Kane deliberately shoved him hard against the side of the rental car, causing him to stumble forward and strike his forehead against the doorframe. "Resisting arrest," Kane announced loudly for the benefit of the remaining witnesses, though Michael had made no attempt to resist. A thin red mark appeared on Michael's forehead where it had contacted the metal. Doyle immediately pulled out his personal cell phone and took several photos of the mark from different angles, though his hands were shaking slightly now, the reality of what they were doing beginning to sink in. Meanwhile, the teenage boy who had been recording suddenly found his phone snatched from his hands by Doyle, who had moved with surprising speed. "Want to go to juvie for interfering with a police investigation?" Doyle snarled at the boy, whose eyes went wide with terror, though something in the younger officer's voice suggested he was convincing himself as much as threatening the teenager. "Because that's exactly where you're headed if you don't delete this footage right now." The teenager's hands shook as he reached for his phone, but Michael's voice cut through the tension with calm authority. "You're being recorded by multiple devices. All of this is being documented." The remaining witnesses looked around nervously, several taking unconscious steps backward. "Doctor." Grant kept her phone steady, but Anna Morales gripped her squeegee tighter, clearly torn between staying to help and protecting herself from retaliation. Kane's face darkened as he realized their usual intimidation tactics weren't having the intended effect on their primary target. The man remained maddeningly calm, even with blood trickling down his forehead. As they forced Michael's hands behind his back and secured the handcuffs, his eyes met those of Dr. Grant through her camera lens. For just a moment, Michael's calm mask slipped, and she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not fear, not anger, calculation. This man was memorizing every face, every word, every action for some purpose she couldn't yet understand. As they pushed him toward the patrol car, Michael's voice carried clearly across the parking lot. "Thank you all for bearing witness to this interaction. The truth has a way of revealing itself eventually." Kane slammed the patrol car door with unnecessary force, cutting off any further communication between Michael and the crowd of increasingly agitated witnesses. As they pulled out of the gas station, leaving behind a parking lot full of concerned citizens and incriminating smartphone footage, neither officer realized they had just provided their new police chief with everything he would need to destroy their careers and transform their department forever. The trap had been set, and they had walked into it eagerly. The back seat of the Marietta police patrol car carried the distinctive institutional smell that Michael recognized from his own years in law enforcement. Disinfectant mixed with fear, hope drained away by too many promises broken and too many rights ignored. He sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, watching the familiar streets of his new jurisdiction roll past through bulletproof glass that had been scratched and clouded by countless previous passengers. "Keep breathing," he told himself as the reality of his vulnerability settled in. "Document everything. But Jesus, if this goes sideways before Ramirez can intervene." The thought of Rodriguez and other victims who hadn't had federal contacts made his chest tighten with a combination of anger and fear he hadn't expected. Officer Kane was driving with deliberately aggressive precision, but now his tactics became more overtly abusive. He took corners at dangerous speeds, slammed on the brakes without warning, and accelerated hard enough to throw Michael violently against the back seat. During one particularly sharp turn, Kane hit the brakes so hard that Michael was thrown forward, his forehead striking the metal partition between the front and back seats. The impact left another red mark on his already bruised forehead, and Kane glanced back with satisfaction. "Careful back there," Kane said with mock concern. "Wouldn't want you to get hurt during transport." Doyle immediately twisted around with his personal cell phone, taking more photos of Michael's injuries from multiple angles, though his earlier enthusiasm seemed forced now, mechanical rather than gleeful. "Looking pretty banged up there," he said, his voice lacking its previous conviction. "Good thing we got documentation of how violent and uncooperative you've been during this whole process." Officer Doyle had twisted around in the passenger seat to stare at Michael with the kind of fascination usually reserved for dangerous animals safely contained behind zoo barriers. His nervous energy was almost palpable, manifesting in constant fidgeting with his radio and repeated adjustments of his sunglasses. "You know something that's really interesting," Doyle said through the intercom system, his voice carrying less confidence than before, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as intimidate Michael. "Most people in your particular situation would be crying by now, begging about constitutional rights and demanding lawyers." Michael's trained eye immediately located the small camera mounted near the roof of the patrol car, a device that was supposed to record everything that happened during arrests and prisoner transport. The detail that caught his attention wasn't the camera itself, but the small indicator light that should have been red if the system was functioning properly. Instead, it was dark, off, not recording, just like it had been during the Rodriguez incident 6 months earlier, just like it always seemed to be when officers Kane and Doyle needed their actions to disappear from the official record. "You got a real smart mouth on you," Kane said, catching Michael's reflection in his rearview mirror. "That kind of attitude is going to cause you some serious problems in this town." But then Kane's frustration began building to dangerous levels. The way this stranger remained calm, professional, almost like he was conducting his own investigation rather than being victimized. It was unnatural, unsettling. Suddenly, Kane slammed on the brakes and pulled to the shoulder, his patience finally snapping. "Get out," he ordered, his voice tight with rage. "Kane, what are you doing?" Doyle asked, his voice cracking with uncertainty as he looked around at the moderately busy street they'd stopped on. "Teaching this smartass a lesson he won't forget," Kane growled, opening his door. But Michael's calm voice cut through the tension. "Officers, you should know that patrol vehicle GPS systems maintain detailed logs of all stops and route deviations. Everything you're doing right now is being recorded by multiple systems." Kane froze, half out of his door, as the implications hit him. Doyle's face went pale as he realized they'd been so focused on the obvious cameras that they'd forgotten about the tracking systems. "He's bluffing," Kane said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Michael replied with that same enigmatic calmness that had been unsettling them all morning. "But are you willing to bet your career on that assumption?" Kane got back in the car, slamming the door with frustrated rage, but continuing toward the station. The rest of the ride passed in tense silence, both officers beginning to realize they might have made a serious miscalculation. Through the rear window, Michael could see Dr. Grant's Toyota Prius following at a discreet distance, the retired professor having made the split-second decision to document whatever happened next. Her phone was mounted on her dashboard, live streaming the pursuit to her social media followers, several of whom were law students and civil rights attorneys who would find this situation very interesting indeed. As they pulled into the parking lot of the Marietta Police Department, Kane made one last attempt to regain psychological control of the situation. "I don't know who you think you are or what kind of game you're trying to play," he growled, "but once we get you inside, you're going to learn real quick about how things work in this town." Michael's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Yes, I believe I am." The primary interrogation room of the Marietta Police Department felt like the inside of a pressure cooker about to explode. The space was designed to break people psychologically. harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows and made everyone look guilty. Institutional furniture bolted to the floor to prevent it from being used as weapons during emotional outbursts. Walls painted in a shade of beige that seemed specifically chosen to drain hope and encourage confessions. Michael sat calmly at the metal table, hands folded despite the handcuffs that had been left on for officer safety. He looked more like a detective conducting an interview than a suspect under interrogation. Meanwhile, officers Kane and Doyle were exhibiting the kind of barely controlled excitement that suggested they viewed this as an opportunity to demonstrate their methods without outside interference. Kane was pacing behind the table like a caged predator, his confident swagger returning now that they were in familiar territory. The interrogation room was his domain, a place where he had broken countless spirits and forced countless confessions over the years. Sweat stains were spreading under his arms despite the aggressive air conditioning, but these were stains of anticipation rather than anxiety. Doyle hunched over a manila folder, carefully arranging what appeared to be evidence bags and official forms, though his movements lacked their earlier precision. His hands trembled slightly as he handled the materials, the weight of the morning's events beginning to affect his confidence. One evidence bag contained what looked like a small quantity of white powder, a substance that definitely hadn't been in Michael's possession when he was arrested. Doyle picked up the evidence bag and held it close to Michael's face, his voice dropping to what he intended as a menacing whisper but came out more uncertain. "Bet you know exactly what this is." Kane moved behind Michael's chair, his presence looming and oppressive, but there was a manic edge to his movements now, the frustration from the transport building into something more dangerous. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," Kane said, though his voice carried no genuine concession and was tight with barely controlled rage. "But the fact remains that you were acting suspiciously, resisted lawful detention, assaulted a police officer and were found in possession of controlled substances." "I was purchasing gasoline," Michael replied evenly, though he could feel the situation escalating toward violence and fought to keep his own tension from showing. "I complied with all lawful orders. I never touched Officer Doyle. And that evidence bag wasn't in your possession when you arrested me." Kane's face flushed red with anger at being contradicted so calmly and directly. He leaned across the table, bringing his face close enough to Michael's that his breath was visible in the cold air. "You calling me a liar, boy?" The racial epithet hung in the air like a challenge. Michael met Kane's gaze steadily, his voice remaining level despite the provocation, though internally he was calculating how quickly this could turn deadly if Kane completely lost control. "I'm stating facts that can be verified by multiple witnesses and recording systems." Kane grabbed a blank confession form and slammed it down in front of Michael with such force that the sound echoed through the small room. His movements were becoming more erratic, more desperate. Then he seized a pen and tried to force it into Michael's handcuffed hands. "You're going to sign this confession right now," Kane growled, his voice rising with desperation and rage. "Admit to possession, admit to resisting arrest, admit to assaulting an officer. Make this easy on yourself." When Michael simply sat back, keeping his hands away from the pen, Kane's control finally began to crack. He straightened and spat directly into Michael's face. The saliva struck his cheek and began running down toward his collar, but Michael's expression didn't change. He calmly reached for a tissue from a box on the table and wiped his face clean, his movements deliberate and controlled. Kane's rage built to a crescendo. He raised his fist and brought it down on the metal table with tremendous force, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The violent noise was designed to shock and intimidate, to break Michael's composure through raw, sudden violence. But Michael barely flinched, though his heart was racing and he could feel sweat beading despite the air conditioning. "Stay calm. Document everything. Help is coming." "You're nothing here," Kane whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss as he leaned closer. "You understand that, nothing. No one's coming to help you. No one cares what happens to you in this room. Every action has consequences," Michael replied quietly, his dark eyes meeting Kane's with unwavering intensity, even as he wondered if he'd made a fatal miscalculation about how far these officers would go. At that moment the door opened and Officers Vega and Henson entered carrying clipboards loaded with official forms. Vega was young, maybe 26, with nervous dark eyes and the kind of earnest expression that suggested he had joined the police force for all the right reasons. His discomfort with the situation was immediately apparent. Henson was a graying veteran, 20 years on the force, with a reputation for integrity that had somehow survived in a department where corruption seemed to flourish. Kane asked us to witness some statement signatures, Vega said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he avoided making direct eye contact with Michael. There was something in his tone, a reluctance and discomfort with what he was being asked to do, that suggested his conscience was already in conflict with his orders. Kane nodded approvingly, but his voice carried an undertone of threat that was impossible to miss. "That's exactly right, Vega. Just routine paperwork, but we need everything documented properly. You understand how important it is to show solidarity with your fellow officers." Doyle slid the prepared paperwork across the table, though his movements lacked their earlier confidence. The documents painted a detailed picture of events that bore only a passing resemblance to reality: a combative suspect who had been acting erratically, possibly under the influence of narcotics, who had become physically aggressive when approached by officers responding to citizen complaints about suspicious behavior. "Before you sign anything, officers," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that inspired trust rather than fear, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing here. Because once you put your names on those documents, you become part of whatever story these officers are trying to construct." Vega's hand froze above the paper, his pen suspended in mid-air as he looked from Michael to Kane to Doyle, clearly wrestling with a decision that could define his entire career. The young officer's Adam's apple bobbed nervously as he swallowed hard. "I wasn't actually present during the arrest, sir," Vega said weakly. "I don't know what happened at the gas station." Kane's voice turned hard and threatening, his desperation making him more dangerous. "Vega, you sign that damn report right now, or you can forget about any future advancement in this department. You want to make detective someday, then you learn to back up your brothers in blue when they need you most." But something in Michael's calm demeanor, his obvious intelligence and education, was making it difficult for Vega to proceed with what he was clearly recognizing as perjury. "Officer Vega," Michael said gently, "how long do you think documents like these would survive federal scrutiny? How long before investigators start asking why none of the events described appear on any camera footage?" "Camera footage?" Vega's voice cracked slightly as he looked at Kane with growing suspicion. "Sir, didn't your patrol car cameras malfunction again during this arrest?" Vega had been hearing whispers about the convenient technical failures that seemed to follow Kane and Doyle's arrests. The maintenance logs that showed consistent malfunctions only during their shifts. The pattern was becoming too obvious to ignore. The pen slipped from Vega's trembling fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Kane's roar of fury filled the room, but it was the sound of a man who knew his time was finally up, and his desperation was making him increasingly unpredictable. "You're making a very big mistake, Vega. Both of you are making mistakes that will follow you for the rest of your careers." Henson, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke with the authority of his 20 years of honest police work. "Kane, I think we need to pause this whole situation and call for supervision." But Kane was beyond reason now, his carefully constructed system of intimidation and control collapsing around him like a house of cards. Years of unchecked power and racial hatred were finally boiling over into pure undiluted rage. It was then that Kane made his most dangerous mistake. Instead of trying to continue the psychological pressure, he lunged toward Doyle, fury overriding any remaining tactical thinking. "Don't say another damn word," Kane roared, his hands closing around his partner's throat in a desperate attempt to silence him. Doyle's eyes went wide with shock and terror as his mentor and protector suddenly became his attacker. The choking cut off his air, his face turning red as he clawed at Kane's hands. "Kane," Doyle gasped, finally understanding that his loyalty meant nothing when Kane's survival was at stake. "What are you?" Vega and Henson moved together, grabbing Kane's thick arms and pulling him away from Doyle with enough force to break his grip. Doyle collapsed against the wall, gasping and clutching his bruised throat. The attack had shattered something fundamental in Doyle's worldview. The man who had shaped his career, who had taught him everything he knew about police work, had just tried to strangle him to protect their dirty secrets. Michael stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, finally able to shed the role of victim and assume something closer to his true nature. "Gentlemen, I believe this would be an excellent time for all of you to consider the oath you took when you became police officers. The part about protecting and serving all citizens equally, regardless of race or social status." As he spoke, the weight of authority in his voice was unmistakable, causing both Vega and Henson to straighten unconsciously. For the first time since the confrontation began, someone in that room was speaking with the voice of legitimate leadership rather than corruption and intimidation. And somewhere in the back of Kane's mind, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form about exactly who they had been tormenting for the past 2 hours. The knock on the interrogation room door came at exactly the moment Michael had been expecting it. He had been mentally counting the minutes since Dr. Grant had started following their patrol car, calculating response times and estimating how long it would take for news of his detention to reach the appropriate authorities through the network of professional contacts he'd cultivated over 25 years in law enforcement. Sergeant Henson answered the door, and Michael immediately recognized the man who entered from the personnel files as a 20-year veteran with an exemplary record and a reputation for integrity that had somehow survived in a department where corruption seemed to flourish. His graying hair and tired eyes spoke to decades of honest police work. Behind him stood a tall Hispanic man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. Special Agent Miguel Ramirez had the kind of commanding presence that immediately changed the atmosphere in any room he entered, radiating the quiet confidence that came from federal authority and years of investigating exactly this type of civil rights violation. "Kane, you need to come out here right now," Henson said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from seniority and respect rather than fear and intimidation. "FBI Special Agent Ramirez is here, and he's asking very specific questions about your activities this morning." The effect of those words was immediate and devastating. The color drained from Doyle's face so quickly that Michael thought the young man might actually faint. His hands began shaking uncontrollably, and he kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air, his earlier doubts crystallizing into full panic. Kane forced a laugh that sounded more like the bark of a wounded animal. "FBI? What the hell does the FBI want with routine local law enforcement activities?" Agent Ramirez stepped fully into the room, and Michael could see other federal agents in the hallway behind him, their serious expressions making it clear this wasn't a social visit. "Officer Kane, Officer Doyle." Ramirez's voice was professionally neutral but carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority. "I'm Special Agent Ramirez with the FBI's Atlanta field office. We need to have a conversation about this morning's events and your treatment of Chief Michael Carter." The silence that followed was so complete that Michael could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the air conditioning cycling on and off, could hear Doyle's labored breathing as the full magnitude of their mistake became clear. Vega's mouth fell open in shock, his young face cycling through disbelief, recognition and dawning horror as he realized he'd almost signed a false police report against his own chief. Doyle was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his thin frame racked with tremors as his world collapsed around him. Kane just stared at Ramirez like he'd been struck by lightning, his mind clearly racing through the implications while calculating damage control strategies. "That's impossible," Kane whispered. "The new chief isn't supposed to arrive until 10 o'clock this morning." Michael finished calmly, checking his watch with deliberate precision. "Which, if I'm not mistaken, is approximately 15 minutes from now. I arrived early to get an authentic feel for the community I'd be serving." Ramirez stepped fully into the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the scene with practiced assessment. The scattered false evidence, the unsigned police reports, the handcuffed police chief sitting calmly while his future subordinates exhibited various stages of panic and disbelief. "Chief Carter, we've been monitoring the situation since Dr. Grant contacted our field office about ongoing surveillance concerns. We have multiple video recordings of this morning's events, including the fabricated evidence and falsified police reports." Michael noted Ramirez's careful phrasing, referencing previous federal interest rather than suggesting this had been a setup. The months of documented complaints and federal monitoring had created the framework for intervention, but the specific incident had been genuine. Kane's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Ramirez was clearly anticipating that possibility. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Officer Kane. You're already in enough trouble." Michael finally stood, his movements deliberate and controlled, able at last to shed the role he'd been forced to play and assume the mantle of leadership he was supposed to wear. "Agent Ramirez, I appreciate the cavalry arriving when it did, but I think we need to let this situation develop a bit further." Officer Vega here was about to make a very important decision about his future. All eyes turned to focus on Vega, who was now visibly shaking as he processed what had been happening around him. The unsigned false reports lay scattered on the floor between him and the table, representing a crossroads between integrity and corruption. "Officer Vega," Michael said gently, his voice carrying the kind of leadership authority that inspired rather than intimidated, "you have a choice to make right now. You can be part of the problem that's been plaguing this department, or you can be part of the solution that's going to make this community safer for everyone who lives here." Vega looked down at the scattered papers, then up at Kane's desperate face, then at Doyle's terrified expression, then finally at Michael's calm and encouraging countenance. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable ring of genuine conviction. "I won't sign it, sir. I can't be part of this anymore. I became a police officer to help people, not to hurt innocent citizens or cover up crimes." Kane's roar of rage echoed off the concrete walls, but it was the sound of a man who knew his empire of intimidation was finally crumbling. But the confrontation was far from over. Kane, seeing his carefully constructed world collapsing, made one final desperate attempt to regain control. But this time, instead of trying to intimidate Michael or threaten Vega, his target became the partner who might expose everything they'd built together. "Shut up," Kane screamed at Doyle, who had been starting to look like he might confess everything. "Don't say another damn word. You'll destroy everything we've worked for." But Doyle, faced with the prospect of federal charges and still clutching his bruised throat from Kane's earlier attack, was already beginning to crack. "Kane, I don't think we should. I said shut up." Kane exploded, but Agent Ramirez had his service weapon drawn and trained on Kane before he could make another move toward his partner. "Officer Kane, you are under arrest for assault, civil rights violations, conspiracy and witness intimidation." It was only then, with federal agents surrounding him and his career in ruins, that Doyle finally broke completely. "He taught me that people like you needed to be put in their place." Doyle sobbed, looking at Michael with tears streaming down his face. "Kane said black people think they're better than they are, that we had to teach them respect for authority. But I never wanted it to go this far." The confession poured out of him, years of systematic harassment, planted evidence, intimidation tactics, all designed to keep certain communities in their place. Kane had been his mentor, his guide into what he believed was real police work. Now he understood it had been systematic criminal behavior disguised as law enforcement. "After everything I taught you," Kane screamed as federal agents restrained him. "After all the times I protected you from the consequences, protected me from what?" Doyle cried, his voice breaking. "From having a conscience, from being a decent human being." And with those words, spoken through tears and pain and the weight of years of accumulated guilt, the last piece of Kane's empire of hatred crumbled into dust, taking with it a system of intimidation and racial harassment that had terrorized the community for far too long. The reckoning had finally come to Marietta. 6 weeks later, the Fulton County Courthouse was packed beyond capacity, overflow crowds on marble steps, satellite trucks lined up like an occupying army. Georgia vs. Kane and Doyle had attracted intense national attention, a symbol of both persistent police corruption and the possibility of meaningful reform. Inside courtroom 4B, tension was thick. Michael sat calmly in the witness chair for the third day, unchanged despite hours of intense questioning from prosecution and defense. His responses had been measured, factual, devastating to defense attempts to portray him as anything other than a victim. Kane sat stone-faced at defendant's table, thick frame squeezed into ill-fitting suit, pale eyes burning with undiminished racial hatred, completely unrepentant. At a separate table, Doyle looked like a man who hadn't slept in months, thin frame grown thinner, nervous energy replaced by hollow exhaustion. Defense attorney Patricia Holloway was making a final desperate attempt to discredit Michael's testimony. Sharp-dressed woman who'd built her reputation defending law enforcement officers accused of misconduct. "Chief Carter," she said, pacing deliberately before the jury with calculated precision, "isn't it true that you deliberately deceived my clients about your identity? That you engineered an elaborate entrapment operation without proper authorization?" Michael met her gaze steadily. "Counselor, I arrived early for my first day as chief and stopped to purchase gasoline. Your clients chose to detain me without probable cause, subject me to racial harassment, and attempt to fabricate evidence. There was no entrapment involved, but you admit you had prior knowledge of numerous complaints against officers Kane and Doyle before this incident. I had reviewed their personnel files during preparation for assuming command, yes, as any responsible administrator would do. Holloway smiled with what she believed was triumph. So you went to that specific gas station at that specific time, knowing there was significant possibility of confrontation with these particular officers. You deliberately put yourself in position where you could entrap my clients into behavior that would end their careers. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Several jury members leaned forward. Michael could see where the defense was trying to lead the narrative, could feel momentum beginning to shift in ways that genuinely concerned him. In the gallery behind prosecution table, he spotted Mrs. Washington's weathered face reflecting hope and anxiety as she watched proceedings with attention of someone whose own experiences were being validated or dismissed. Next to her sat the teenager who had recorded the initial confrontation, smartphone footage having become crucial evidence. Miss Holloway, Michael said quietly, voice carrying across suddenly silent courtroom, are you suggesting your clients had no choice but to violate my civil rights, that they were somehow compelled to threaten an innocent citizen with racial slurs and false arrest? I'm suggesting you manipulated the situation for your own purposes, deliberately provoking these officers into actions they wouldn't normally take. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh started to rise with objection, but Michael held up slight hand. No, I'll answer that. He turned to face jury directly with moral authority from years of honest service. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be clear about what happened. I stopped for gasoline at a public station across from the police department I was about to lead. Two uniformed officers approached me without legitimate law enforcement purpose, subjected me to racial harassment, threatened me with deadly weapon, detained me illegally, then attempted to fabricate evidence to cover up their misconduct. Complete silence now, even reporters stopping their note-taking. At what point, Michael continued, voice gaining strength, did I force them to break the law? At what point did I compel them to use racial slurs? At what point did I make them threaten an innocent citizen with violence? At what point did I force them to turn off their body cameras to hide criminal behavior? He paused, letting questions hang before continuing with greater intensity. Furthermore, if officers Kane and Doyle react this way to a well-dressed professional purchasing gasoline in broad daylight across from their own station, how do you think they treat people who can't fight back? People who don't have federal contacts, people like Mrs. Washington sitting in this courtroom today because she finally found courage to come forward about her own experiences. Mrs. Washington straightened, dignity intact despite obvious difficulty. Several jury members turned to look with sympathy and recognition. Michael could see his words having intended impact. The real question isn't whether I knew about their misconduct history, Michael said, voice carrying full weight of conviction. The real question is how many other innocent citizens have been victimized by these officers, and why it took someone with my resources and federal connections to finally bring them to justice. Courtroom erupted in mixture of applause and angry shouts from different sections. Judge Morrison banged gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but emotional impact was undeniable. Several jury members nodded in obvious agreement, but Patricia Holloway had one more card to play. Your Honor, she said, raising voice above continuing murmur, the defense would like to introduce new evidence crucial to understanding these events. Documentation showing that Chief Carter had been in contact with federal authorities about this specific department for several months before the incident in question. Michael felt genuine surprise. This was completely unexpected, but not necessarily damaging if handled properly. Phone records appeared on screens throughout the courtroom, showing multiple calls between Michael and various federal offices during his preparation for the chief position. Ladies and gentlemen, Holloway said with dramatic flair, gesturing toward screen, these records show Chief Carter was in extensive communication with federal agents about systemic problems in this department. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a coordinated investigation designed to destroy my clients' careers. Courtroom buzzed with renewed energy. Several jury members who had been nodding in Michael's favor now looked confused and uncertain. Even Judge Morrison was leaning forward, studying the evidence with obvious interest and concern. Michael felt the case beginning to slip away despite all evidence presented. After everything they had exposed about systematic corruption and racial harassment, would it all come down to misinterpreted phone records? But Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood slowly from prosecution table, and Michael could see slight smile suggesting she had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her confidence seemed to fill the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, voice cutting through tension, "the prosecution would like to clarify something very important about these phone records that defense counsel has just introduced with such dramatic flair." She approached screen with laser pointer, highlighting specific details most observers had missed. Defense counsel is absolutely correct that these calls took place during Chief Carter's preparation for his new position. However, she is completely wrong about their purpose and content. Walsh clicked a remote, and suddenly transcript portions of those conversations appeared on the courtroom screens with perfect clarity. The jury and everyone else could read Agent Ramirez's documented concerns about ongoing civil rights complaints, and Michael's responses expressing professional interest in ensuring proper oversight and constitutional compliance. "As you can clearly see," Walsh continued, voice gaining strength as truth became undeniable, "Chief Carter was responding to federal briefings about existing complaints and investigations already in progress. He didn't initiate federal interest in this department, he inherited a situation already under scrutiny." The transcripts continued with devastating effect on defense's entrapment theory, showing Michael repeatedly asking questions about proper procedures and constitutional requirements rather than planning any kind of setup. Furthermore, Walsh said, clicking to another section, "You'll notice Chief Carter repeatedly emphasized the importance of giving officers every opportunity to demonstrate professional behavior and constitutional compliance. He didn't want to assume guilt, he wanted to hope his concerns were unfounded." Michael watched jury faces as truth became impossible to deny. He hadn't been setting up elaborate entrapment, he had been trying to understand the department he was inheriting, and ensure that any necessary interventions would be handled according to proper legal procedures. But the most devastating evidence was yet to come. "Your Honor," Walsh continued, voice now carrying full prosecutorial authority, "the prosecution also has additional audio recordings captured by backup surveillance system in Officers Kane and Doyle's patrol car. A system defendants were completely unaware existed, and therefore never thought to disable." New audio began playing, and suddenly Kane's voice filled the courtroom with chilling clarity. "The thing about people like that is they don't understand respect. They think because they got some rights written down on paper somewhere, they can just waltz around acting like they own the place." Then Doyle's voice, eager and conspiratorial, "Remember that Rodriguez situation last month, the one who got mouthy at the traffic stop?" Kane's response sent visible shudder through courtroom and made several jury members gasp. "Oh, you mean the little wetback who suddenly decided he didn't want to press charges after our educational conversation in the back of the car?" Reaction was immediate and visceral. Several jury members looked physically sick. Gasps and angry murmurs filled gallery as full extent of officers' racial hatred became undeniably clear. Kane just sat with face twisted into mask of defiant racial hatred, completely unrepentant. "This audio recording," Walsh said, voice cutting through emotional chaos, "was captured before these officers ever laid eyes on Chief Carter. It demonstrates their established mindset, systematic pattern of racial harassment and civil rights violations, complete disregard for constitutional rights of citizens they were sworn to protect." The prosecution then played additional recordings from previous incidents, painting devastating picture of systematic abuse going on long before Michael arrived. Conversations about keeping certain people in their place, discussions of teaching respect to citizens who didn't know their role, casual use of racial slurs, making it impossible to argue the gas station incident had been isolated occurrence. Patricia Holloway made one final desperate attempt to salvage her case, arguing her clients were products of their environment and deserved consideration for years of service. But Judge Morrison had clearly heard enough. "Miss Holloway, unless you have credible evidence that Chief Carter actually committed a crime, or that your clients were acting under duress, I suggest you conclude your defense immediately." The trial ended 2 days later with speed that surprised veteran legal observers. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Kane was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, assault, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and abuse of authority under color of law. The judge noted during sentencing that Kane's complete lack of remorse and continued expression of racial hatred made him a continuing danger to any community. Doyle, who had cooperated fully with federal prosecutors and revealed the extent of the corruption network, received 5 years. His cooperation led to broader investigation that eventually implicated 6 additional officers and resulted in early retirement of the previous police chief, who claimed ignorance of systematic violations under his leadership. Officer Vega was not only commended by the federal judge but fast-tracked for promotion to detective. His decision to choose integrity over career advancement made him a symbol of what law enforcement could represent. Sergeant Henson, who had helped restrain Kane during his assault on Doyle and cooperated fully with federal investigation, was promoted to lieutenant and became one of Michael's most trusted advisors in implementing comprehensive reforms. But the most significant changes weren't happening in courtrooms. They were taking place in Marietta's streets and neighborhoods, where citizens were beginning to trust their police department for the first time in years. 1 year later, Michael stood once again in the Chevron station parking lot, where everything had begun on that humid Tuesday morning. The familiar sounds of rush-hour traffic on Cobb Parkway provided backdrop for his reflections on how much had changed, though the work was far from finished. The gas station had installed a small bronze plaque near Pump 3, funded by community donations from citizens who wanted to commemorate what happened and ensure it would never be forgotten. The inscription read, "In recognition of the courage required to stand up for justice even when standing alone. Dedicated to all who refuse to be silent in the face of injustice." Mrs. Washington approached as he finished reading the inscription. At 73, she moved slowly but with unmistakable dignity of someone who had finally found her voice after years of enforced silence. "Chief Carter," she said, weathered hands clutching small bouquet of garden flowers, "I wanted to thank you personally one more time. Not just for what you did that morning, but for showing all of us we don't have to live in fear anymore." Michael smiled, genuinely moved but also aware that progress remained fragile. "Mrs. Washington, you were the brave one. You stayed to witness when you could have driven away. You came forward to testify when it would have been easier to stay silent. That took real courage." She shook her head firmly, placing flowers at the base of the plaque with reverence usually reserved for fallen heroes. "I stayed because I was tired of being afraid, tired of watching good people get hurt and not being able to do anything. When I saw you standing up to them, refusing to back down even when they threatened you, it reminded me that sometimes you have to take a stand for what's right, even when you're scared." Across the street, the Marietta Police Department had been transformed, though challenges remained. Body cameras were now mandatory, equipped with tamper-proof technology making it impossible to disable during citizen interactions. A civilian oversight board, representing every demographic group in Marietta, now reviewed all complaints with authority to recommend disciplinary action independent of police administration. An anonymous tip line, managed by outside agency to ensure complete independence, allowed both citizens and officers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, comprehensive retraining had been implemented for all personnel, focusing on constitutional rights, de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the fundamental principle that all citizens deserve dignity and respect regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or social status. Detective Vega approached them as they stood by the memorial plaque. Michael was struck by how much the young man had grown during the past year, though he knew some officers still resented the changes and made Vega's position difficult at times. Now 28 and seasoned by his experiences during the Kane investigation, Vega carried himself with quiet confidence of someone who had faced a moral test under extreme pressure and emerged stronger. "Chief, we received another commendation letter today, this one from the Rodriguez family," Vega reported with cautious pride. "Tommy says his younger brother isn't afraid to walk through the neighborhood anymore, though the family still wanted me to tell you they appreciate the extra patrols. That makes 12 positive letters this month, though we also had 3 complaints about officers being too soft on enforcement." Michael nodded with measured satisfaction, understanding that real change was messy and incomplete. His attention was drawn to something happening in Marietta Square across the street. A small group of children from the local elementary school was playing basketball with 2 young officers, their laughter mixing with traffic sounds, though several parents watched from a distance with expressions that ranged from cautious approval to lingering suspicion. The officers weren't just supervising or projecting community engagement for public relations, they were actually playing with genuine enthusiasm, teaching proper shooting techniques to smaller kids, encouraging those struggling with fundamentals, celebrating good plays regardless of which team made them. But Michael could see it would take years before such interactions felt natural to everyone involved. Among the officers was Sarah Chen, a young Asian American woman who had joined the force 6 months earlier, specifically attracted by the reform efforts. During her interview, she had told Michael she wanted to be part of building something better, something that truly served all members of the community equally. She was good at her job, but Michael knew she faced resistance from some veterans who saw reform as criticism of their methods. "You know what I've learned from all of this," Michael said, watching the careful interaction between officers and children that had become more common but was still far from universal. "What's that, Chief?" Vega asked, following his gaze toward the basketball game. "Justice doesn't always arrive when we want it to, and it rarely comes easily. Real change takes time, years, sometimes decades. Sometimes it takes patience that tests your faith. Sometimes it takes courage that costs you personally. Sometimes it takes people getting so tired of being afraid that they finally decide to take action despite the risks. But most of all, it takes ordinary people willing to do what's right, even when nobody's watching, and then doing it again tomorrow when it's still hard." Mrs. Washington nodded thoughtfully, eyes also fixed on children playing across the street, though she too noticed parents maintaining watchful distances. "And when everybody is watching, when the whole world is paying attention like it was during the trial." Michael's smile was more measured now, tempered by the reality of sustained change. When everybody's watching, that creates opportunity. But the real test comes later, when the cameras are gone and the attention has moved elsewhere. That's when you discover whether change was real or just performed for an audience. A young Latino boy broke away from the basketball game and ran across the street toward them, face bright with excitement, though Michael noticed his mother watched nervously from across the street before following at a brisk pace. The boy held a basketball under one arm. "Chief Carter, Chief Carter," the boy called breathlessly, voice filled with excitement, but also the careful politeness of a child who had been taught to be respectful around police officers. "Officer Chen taught me how to shoot free throws. Want to see what I learned? I made 5 out of 10 this morning." Michael looked down at the child, who was probably about the same age Tommy Rodriguez had been when Kane and Doyle first targeted his family. The difference was significant but incomplete. This boy wasn't afraid of police, but he wasn't entirely comfortable either. He was excited to share his accomplishment, but it was excitement tempered by the caution his family had taught him. "I'd love to see," Michael said sincerely, allowing the enthusiastic child to grab his hand and lead him toward the basketball court, though he noticed the boy's mother approaching quickly to monitor the interaction. As they walked toward the game, Mrs. Washington fell into step beside them, weathered face reflecting cautious hope rather than wonder. "You know," she said quietly, voice carrying wisdom of 7 decades of life in the American South, "my grandmother used to tell me that change comes slowly, but it comes surely, if enough good people are willing to push for it, generation after generation, even when the pushing gets hard and dangerous and feels like it's not working." Michael nodded, thinking about all the people who had pushed when it mattered most and all those who would need to continue pushing in the years ahead. The work was ongoing, imperfect, sometimes frustrating, but it was real. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman," he said with deep respect and genuine admiration. As the afternoon sun climbed higher over Marietta, Georgia, Chief Michael Carter found himself surrounded by children and police officers of different backgrounds, some laughing together and learning from each other, others maintaining careful distances while they slowly built trust. The police station across the street represented hope for what was possible when good people refused to remain silent in the face of injustice, but also the ongoing challenge of sustaining reform beyond the moment of crisis that had created it. The confrontation at the Chevron station had lasted less than 30 minutes on that humid morning a year earlier, but its impact would require generations to fully realize. The changes it sparked were bearing fruit in ways that could be measured not in statistics or policy documents, but in incremental shifts of trust, cautious interactions becoming slightly more relaxed, and children who might grow up expecting police officers to protect rather than threaten them. Tommy Rodriguez's little brother could now walk through his neighborhood without being afraid of the people supposed to protect him, though his family remained watchful and had taught him careful protocols for any police interaction. Mrs. Washington could file complaints without fear of retaliation, though she knew that vigilance was required to maintain that protection. Officer Chen could do her job without worrying about retaliation from corrupt colleagues, though she navigated resistance from some veterans who saw reform as unwarranted criticism. That progress, Michael realized as he watched the boy attempt his free throw with careful concentration, was his true legacy in Marietta. Not the dramatic confrontation or federal investigation or comprehensive policy reforms, but the slow, difficult work of building trust one interaction at a time, knowing that setbacks were inevitable, and that the work would never truly be finished. Justice, he had learned through painful personal experience, wasn't a destination you reached but a direction you traveled, sometimes making progress and sometimes losing ground, but always requiring people who were willing to keep walking toward the ideal of equal protection and dignity for all citizens. As streetlights began to come on and families started calling children home for dinner, Michael took one final look at the Chevron station across the street where everything had changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new bridges to build between police and community. There would always be more work in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality, because that struggle never truly ended, and progress was never guaranteed to be permanent. But tonight, for the first time in many years, most people in Marietta could go to sleep knowing that accountability was possible, that the badge meant something more than it had before, and that change was happening, even if it was slower and more fragile than anyone would have preferred. Standing in the gathering dusk, surrounded by sounds of a community cautiously learning to trust its protectors again, Chief Michael Carter understood this was what victory looked like in the real world. Not dramatic courtroom scenes or newspaper headlines, but the gradual, fragile, precious work of building trust between human beings across lines of difference, one conversation and one interaction at a time. The memorial plaque would weather many seasons, but the change it represented lived in the daily choices of people who had learned that justice was worth fighting for, even when progress was slow, even when setbacks occurred, even when the work seemed endless. As he finally turned to head home, Michael thought about Kane serving his federal sentence and Doyle working through his own process of understanding and redemption. The work continued for everyone involved, perpetrators and victims and communities alike, all trying to build something better than what had come before. Here in Marietta, children were learning to see police officers as potential helpers rather than automatic threats, though their parents taught them appropriate caution. Citizens were approaching cops with requests for help instead of fleeing in fear, though trust remained conditional and required constant nurturing. Everyone understood the badge was meant to protect and serve all people, though living up to that ideal required daily vigilance and commitment. That understanding, that ongoing work, that recognition that justice required constant effort represented the true measure of progress, and a legacy that would endure as long as people were willing to keep building it, one day at a time. The boy's laughter echoed across the square as he made 3 shots in a row, and Chief Michael Carter smiled, knowing that sound was among the truest measures of hope for the future, even as he understood how much work remained to make that hope a permanent reality for every child in every community.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.